Hi, welcome to the G Research Open Source Software Outreach Podcast, which we're calling the Gross Out Podcast. I'm Jay Faulkner. I'm going to be your host for this episode and all of our future episodes. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and what we're doing here. I've been an open source software user, operator, developer, leader over the course of a over decade-long career in open source. So I'm hoping to use this podcast to show you some of the neat things that G Research are doing in open source, and not to spin it. We're going to tell you the real true story about what makes working in software sometimes a little gross. But let me introduce you to my first guest, Alex, who is one of our leaders here at G Research Open Source Software. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your history in open source, Alex?
Sure. As you mentioned, thank you very much for having me. The first one of the first series. This is fun. This is great. I largely run the team of open source people here at G Research, and my history in open source, I believe I got my first taste for it in PHP and MySQL days, when I all of a sudden realized that you could do all these fancy things for free with all this free software, and I became an instant leecher. I loved it. I could do things absolutely for free when before it had been behind lots of paid pieces of software. But I don't think it dawned on me that I could actually contribute to this world for quite a long time. I did a little bit of it, contributions at Yahoo. I was at Yahoo for a while and tried to make some contributions to Selenium, except that I think I did it terribly wrong, and they were very nice to me, pointing out that I didn't know what I was talking about, but my ego was confronted and I ran away in terror. And then I joined Rackspace, where you and I worked together long ago, and there I ended up running a metrics storage as a service, which was also an open source project. And a lot of the OpenStack world was open source, and the office that we were working out of was very open source friendly. And so I really grew to understand more about what it meant to contribute, and the right ways to do it and the wrong ways to do it. And in fact, probably learned a lot from that metrics as a service project about how not to engage the community, and so lots of lessons learned through the years. Which leads us to the gross thing.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Yeah. The one thing I wanted to point out there is that it's interesting that you sort of hit a wall when you first started working open source. That's actually a really common thing, and that's part of the reason why we wanted to make sure that this podcast is going to shine a light on those sort of hiccups, because everyone likes to talk about their successes. You like to see people's, best face in social media. But the reality is, when you're a software developer of any type, open source, whatever, you're going to hit a lot of walls and a lot of speed bumps. And the trick sometimes is to keep going. So let's talk a little bit, like, before we go into what G Research is, let's talk about, like, what is G Research, like, in terms of the software, and like, how is that different from G Research open source software? Are they like the same thing, or how does that work, Alex?
First of all, G Research is not Google Research. It's an entirely separate company. It's a quantitative research firm based in London that essentially tries to predict movements in the markets and therefore make money on those movements of the markets. And the basis of the company is a whole bunch of very clever quants, mathematicians, trying to look for patterns in data that we're analyzing. And then if we find a signal, we'll figure out a way of making trades based on those signals. And so there's some mathematicians at the top, and then a lot of engineering to support those people, and then a lot of infrastructure engineering to support the people who are supporting the quants. And there's this huge pyramid of engineering that comes from this very simple premise of, can we find some signal in some data and make some trades smarter on it? And that's the company that we support in the open source world. And the way that the two, so that's G Research, and then we have this team that we lovingly call GR-OSS, G Research OSS, open source software. And the two are linked because it turns out that to do the kinds of work that those clever mathematician quant people want to do, these days you have to rely almost entirely on open source tools. All the data science, machine learning tools of the day, by and large, are open source. And if our team of very smart people run into issues, we, the G Research open source software team, are here to support them, either to fix issues, to create new, to add features to these things, to sometimes just be a sounding board to the engineering team in G Research about what's right, what we're seeing out in the open source world, which direction to go, which library to use. All of these things are very, very valuable to G Research, the company, and are the kinds of things that we, as the open source team, provide for it.
Yeah, and I'll note that the podcast, part of what we're going to be doing is bringing in different people from those disciplines to talk about like what they know and sort of how that share some of the stories from building out that infrastructure. So that's looking forward to that. So the actual like calling, like I know that G Research open source software is GR-OSS. It's kind of there, but not a lot of companies or organizations would be willing to just embrace the acronym GROSS. So is there some type of story or background, or did you have to get permission from someone? Like, how did you sort of get this whimsical acronym through, to a financial services company's representative as a financial company's representative?
Well, I think we just started doing it. I don't think we asked for permission for anybody. We were looking for some cute acronym, and we were going through the OSGR, Oscar, could do that, or GR-OSS, meaning big. And all of a sudden I was like, no, we can do GR-OSS. That would be awesome. I think partly inspired by Calvin and Hobbes and sort of an impish delight in terrible things. Now, that acronym was for his Calvin clubhouse of boys and tigers. It was the get rid of slimy girls, which is not what we want to do here. That's not what we're doing. But Calvin was being an idiot in making that thing, and to some degree, I enjoy not being too terribly serious with what we're doing. We have to enjoy what we're doing, and part of that is kind of making fun of ourselves. We're doing very, very hard work a lot of the time. A lot of the work takes years to see through to the end, and you have to be able to do it with a smile on your face. This is just one tiny way that I enjoy what I do every day. So
one of the things is someone who's has worked at Gross for over a year, almost 2 years now. I sort of have noticed that like the way we do things, especially digging into that like things that may take years, that can be difficult to do in a lot of companies, even in terms of like an open source policy office. So like, can you tell me about like maybe what's special about Gross and how it helps out G Research that maybe is different than most other open source policy offices?
Yeah, I mean the main difference is that we include engineering within the open source program office, whereas a lot of other OSPOs can sometimes just focus on either policy or legal or marketing or developer relations. There are these other approaches to OSPOs that usually are the focus. And often it's because an OSPO is within a much, much larger company, and the game is to facilitate, to enable 50,000 developers at wherever, Intel or Facebook or Meta, wherever there is. Facebook, Meta, yes, same. Facilitate and engage those engineers across the company in being able to do open source. Whereas here, while we also want to enable the developers, the engineers within G Research to do that too, because it's a much smaller company, around 1,000 people, there's a limit to how much extra time those engineers can take off essentially and focus on upstream stuff. So we've seen fit to actually have an engineering department that as part of the OSPO. That's the primary difference between us and a lot of other open source program offices. But you had another question in there. About the long term. I felt like you were asking, why is it that we can do the long term things?
Exactly.
Right? To be honest, when we started, we were very. We were more cautious to do things that were on a short to medium term turnaround. I didn't want to come in here and say, hey, there's this open source thing. It's going to take 3 years to see this whole story out. Just sit back and wait. Don't worry. Instead, what we did was we went around and we canvassed the entire engineering, the entire research departments for all the places where they were suffering open source problems. There were some very, very long-term projects. There were some very, very short-term projects. And to start with, we chose a lot of the short to medium-term things and then built up this reputation that we had delivered on the goods. And as we were contributing and delivering on those things, after 6 months, a year, we had enough social capital to pick off slightly larger things and slightly larger things until all of a sudden, G Research was coming to us and saying, hey, we have this desire to use this technology. We'll use the ozone example as an example, where G Research knew it wasn't ready for prime time 3-4 years ago, but they wanted to help develop it to see if it would get there. And so G Research came to us, the open source team, to say, hey, can we fund a long-term investment in this thing? And it may not pan out. We're okay with that. We just want to contribute and see if this technology can get to where we want it to get to. So it was starting with the small, achievable wins and building into larger things, which, there are many of those now.
No, that's actually, it's like you built trust over the course of several years that now we're sort of trusted to move ahead with that. That's pretty neat. And I think we'll not go too much into detail there because I'll spoil the rest of the podcast series because surprise, surprise, we're going to be focusing on open source projects that G Research has contributed to or uses, or think for at least to get us started here, because there are lots of good things that are happening that aren't being talked about a lot. So, sort of shifting to that direction, let's talk about how is this podcast fit into that model, right? Like, I'm an engineer and some of my time is being used to do this podcast. So what how does this tie into that whole, story we're weaving?
I mean, from a very holistic point of view, we believe that if the ecosystems that we count on and depend on are healthy, then we will be better for it. The long-term thinking here is that if we're engaged in using PyTorch or Kubernetes or on down the list of open source things, that we need to also contribute to making those ecosystems and communities healthy, whatever that means, whether it's in code, whether it's in personalities on stage talking about things, whether it's helping in working groups, whatever it is, helping the community be healthy only benefits us in the long term. Like, we could take the opposite problem where a community becomes unhealthy and we're using something in a community that withers and dies. In that world, there's a very real impact on us, G Research, their engineering department. G Research will have to have to do some migration from the technology that they were using to something else, and that costs money. And in our evaluation, it's way cheaper for us to engage a community and to help it and to not let it die. And so that comes all the way down through helping big communities like Kubernetes, all the way down to smaller communities like the Spark Magic or Console.net projects that we help maintain these days. And it also is in terms of education around open source software, if we just build the entire open source ecosystem and help that, we know that we're going to be better for it. And so we engage things like Major League Hacking, or have this kind of a podcast to help get people engaged and have people thinking about all the ways that we can contribute. So
yeah, it's interesting. There used to be a lot of talk. It used to be like one of the primary selling points for open source is like the idea of feeling like a force multiplier. But I think that is really what we see happening at times. There have been times when, in my role as OpenStack Technical Committee Chair, that I've been able to use the fact that G-Research is willing to dedicate a small amount of resources to pull in other resources from other contributors toward a common goal. And unless you have both of those hands there, I think we're willing to help, and also we're willing to influence and give the full picture and talk to maybe the type of person who might be more of a business or a product person who wouldn't be in open source communities but might subscribe to the podcast. That's why I'm a little bit excited about this job and excited about the podcast in general, getting that started, of showing what we're doing, the good things we're doing, and hopefully getting other people to join us in the good. So, we've sort of played at this before, but I think the idea is that this is the Gross Outreach podcast, sort of in that sense of the playfulness, right? Like I think we've got a better use of the Gross acronym than a child and a stuffed tiger does, for sure.
Yes.
But by using it, using that title, Saints Gross Outreach, I think like that's a feeling we want to get from this, that we're going to have, straightforward conversations about what's going on. Open source is done in the open, and we kind of want to be open about our experiences with it. And, right now it's, we're talking lots of positive things, but I can tell you there's going to be times when we're going to talk about things that were a pain, open source projects that we might have struggled to get code into or struggled with technical problems on. And that's sort of the heart of this is, I really appreciate that you started with that personal story about contributing to Selenium, because that really gets to the heart of it, is that I hope that someone listening to one of these podcasts will get the idea that we're all trying to figure it out as we're going, right? There's levels of expertise, is just how far you might have to dig through the jungle before you find the solution. It doesn't save us from having to dig through all of that. So, is there like any sort of fun anecdote that you maybe have of like a little bit of a gross type of situation you've had to navigate as a leader of the org? Like I'm not going to ask you to dig into the technical stuff. I don't think we want to talk about technology that old, but we can dig into I'm curious if there were any, gross situations you've had to tackle as a leader of the gross group here.
In terms of like the difficult problems that need to be navigated. Yes, tons and tons. I think what's interesting is that it's such a social art, even though it's a very technical job. At the end of the day, code needs to be written, technical things need to be done, but a lot of the challenges come from engaging community, and that includes internal community as well as the external, larger open source community. When we started this whole thing, G-Research was a very, very insular and cloistered universe that was very, very protective of itself and really didn't want to communicate to anybody about what they were doing. And all of a sudden I show up and I'm like, hey, I'm the open source dude. Hey, let's talk about what you're doing. And you could see all of these people sort of regarded like, who are you? Is this some red team ruse that like they're trying to open me up to see what secrets I would give away and then make an example of me? Like there were lots of people who honestly thought that I was some bad guy who was trying to infiltrate their ranks. And so there have been a couple of levels of this. I mean, first of all, there was that initial level of just like, who is this guy? And then once people got comfortable with me, getting the next wave of team members comfortable with, or the G-Research people comfortable with the next wave of team. But at every point, that still needs to be reestablished. We just had a a situation last couple of weeks where we were doing some really good cleanup of the public repos in GitHub that we have, and we had forgotten to take the initial step of reaching out to the maintainer. In this case, the maintainer was somebody who works at G-Research, and but because it's an internal person, we sort of skipped that step, a step that we would absolutely do if it was an external project. And it was just a reminder that internal projects shouldn't be treated any differently from external projects, that this is still, as I say, a social art, that we need to talk to people and need to meet them where they're at before, because if we just go in and start making unilateral changes to their project, they will rightfully be kind of annoyed by it. So, just a reminder. Yeah.
All right. So that sounds good. And I usually would follow that up with a question of like actionable advice, but I think you dug it in there several times, that you just have to have the conversations with people and work to build that rapport and communicate, let folks know what's going on. Is there anything else you wanted to tell the folks who might be listening before we let you go, Alex?
Well, I've been on a big kick to talk about that point that we made earlier about how the Gross team includes engineering. And one of my hopes over the next couple of years is that we can get more companies thinking along the lines of G-Research, that they too can have an open source department that has actual engineering people as part of the team to actually get stuff done out in the open. It's fine for companies to contribute monetarily to foundations or through all of the opportunities now through Tidelift, GitHub sponsors, a whole bunch of ways, Open Collective, to give back monetarily. But I think from our work, it's very clear that if you can contribute meaningfully directly with actual engineering that impacts you, it will probably benefit the community the most. And one of the ways that you can give as directly as possible is to have a team like ours that is dedicated to actually doing exactly that. And so I've been on a kick to say that, so I'm going to say it again. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah, the built-in feedback loop that you get from that sort of engagement is really something else. When you work on large infrastructure projects like I do, it can be difficult to even know what your users might want. And having like, this is a specific user I care about, you can advocate their use case, makes a big difference. So thanks so much, Alex. This is more or less the end of our first episode of the Gross Out podcast. We'll be talking to you next time. We'll have Jonathan Gianuzzi on, and we'll be talking to him about Fast Track ML. And I'm an infrastructure guy. I'm not an AI and an ML guy. So don't worry if you're not into AI or ML. I'm going to be asking all of the 101 level questions to understand what's going on so that we can all talk and understand the value that Fast Track brings and the stuff that Jonathan's been leading up. But for now, I'm Jay Faulkner. This is the Gross Out Podcast, and thanks for listening. Have a nice day.